Okay, we're live.
Great.
How are you, Claire?
I'm good, thanks, Maureen. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So, Claire, we've recently connected after, I don't know, 35 years of not being in
Yeah,
touch or something like that.
for sure, for sure. The last I remember you, you were a teenager.
That was a while ago.
A while ago,
That's right.
for both of us.
Yeah, for sure. And you reached out to me because which I really am grateful for. I'm gonna take my glasses off because I know that my lights are reflecting. But you reached out to me, and I'm so happy you did. And you listened to something on my website, which you related to.
Absolutely. You talked about your children and the issues you had with mental health and with drug use. So I knew I had a lot of those same experiences, and so I reached out to you. I thought your message was so wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. And so we had a good chat, and now you've agreed to come on my podcast, which I'm super happy about. And I didn't know a lot about your journey with mental health and addictions. So maybe can you summarize for us what your experience with mental health and addictions has been with your kids?
Sure. Well, as you know, I'm the mom of 5,
Mm-hmm.
and life's journey has certainly had its ups and downs, surprises, things I didn't expect at all. Maybe the first surprise was when our older kids were 3, 5, and 7, we found out we were having twins. So we had 5 kids, and that turned out to be just wonderful. It was a great journey through their childhood. Teenage years were easy, really, compared to what I hear some people go through. Our kids, there were the usual things, finding a case of beer in the closet, um, finding out that Kevin had experimented with some drugs at field parties,
Mm-hmm.
but never anything that I thought was a big problem. And most parents don't really know what all the kids are doing all the time. We find out about it a bit later. So once we got them heading to university, we thought they were on their way. We'd done a good job. We were okay. And then in their 20s and 30s, 4 of my boys all experienced at one time or another, and in different, some worse than others, mental health issues with depression and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our sons, his depression and anxiety has still been an issue after many years. He's struggled with it a long time. So that's been hard to see him go through that. And then Kevin, our middle son, continued on in university experimenting with some drugs. We didn't know anything about that. One day after I can't remember if he was already married or not, but he came home because he was going through a really bad stage of anxiety, and he told me he had used ecstasy.
Mm-hmm.
And of course I was concerned, I was angry, I was upset. But the biggest occurrence happened after Kevin was married, and his wife Sarah, one day when she went up to bed, he was in bed, he was not breathing, not breathing well, he was very shallow breathing, turning a bit blue. She called 911, and they came, and they told her, "Did you know your husband was using heroin?" She had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
And so Kevin phoned us to tell us what had happened, and I was absolutely shocked.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember when he was using marijuana, and I said to him, "Kevin, that's going to lead to other things. Maybe you'll try something harder later on." "Mom, I would never do that." But obviously he did. And even at the time, we thought maybe it was a one-off thing, that he wasn't going to keep using it, but he did. And when we realized that it was becoming a real problem, he came home. His wife said, "I can't deal with this." He came home. Um, and at that point, I realized he was using uh, using needles to inject the heroin. And so we got him into rehab, and he did end up going to detox, went to rehab. And at the end of about, maybe a couple of months in rehab, he ended up using again, and so they sent him out. But he was determined at that time to really fight this. And he went into another detox in Toronto and eventually went back home to his wife. And he went back to university. He got his master's in social work during that time. And they had 2 little girls that he absolutely adored. And he was a great dad. He had so much fun with them. And Kevin was always, he was such a fun guy, to have around. Our family loved when he was at the gatherings because he always got us going. He was so much fun. But anyways, Sarah continued to sometimes find needles around the house. But whenever when she caught him and he had a slip kind of thing, he always said, I'm going to get right back on the horse. And he would go to Narcotics Anonymous. He went to a step group. And throughout this time, he maintained his job. He worked at a nursing home for 10 years as a social worker. And, but still this addiction was, it's never going to go away. Once you're addicted, you're addicted. But he fought against it really hard. I know he did. But whenever he'd slip, he'd call, and I would get really angry at him, saying, how can you do this to your wife? Can't you just carry something in your wallet to say, don't do it? Look at a picture of your kids and say, don't do it. And so for the first couple of slips, I would get really, really angry. But the last slip that I knew of, like when he called, we talked a lot about what the craving was like. And when he explained it to me, I started to have a bit more understanding about the addiction. He, in his Narcotics Anonymous, he got his 1-year medallion for staying away from the drug, and then he slipped. And then he got his 2-year medallion and he slipped. And the last time was his 1-year medallion, which he got in the end of June 2016. And on August the 7th, 2016, when his wife and the children were up at a cottage, Kevin used heroin and died of an accidental drug overdose. So that was undescribable, devastating to have that happen.
Can't imagine, Claire.
Yeah. So it's been a journey since then. It was, when we first found out about the heroin, my husband and I went to a place called Forecast, which is an addiction service, so that we could find out more about addiction. And I learned a lot from Sarah, Kevin's wife, during this time too, because she learned a lot about it, and we learned that relapses were a part of recovery. And I really believe that, when Kevin died, if he hadn't used for a while, he used too much. I absolutely know it wasn't intentional. He had so many plans, even for the next couple of days. He was meeting with some friends from high school. And anyways, the other thing was, most of Kevin's friends didn't know at all. Like, of course, our family knew, my siblings, my family knew. Sarah's friends knew, but Kevin kept it very well hidden. And at his funeral, people were blown away that this is what had happened. Because, you know, if you saw Kevin on the street, you'd never think of him as, there's such a stigma about addiction.
Yes.
And people have this image of, you know, they see on the news people on the east side in Vancouver, or homeless people, a lot of whom do have issues with substance use. But I didn't know anything really about addiction, because I never thought it would ever enter our lives, you know. And then I learned that it doesn't have boundaries. It can affect anybody, you know. So that's, I guess, my journey up to
Yeah,
that
thank
point.
you for that. So how old was Kevin when he died?
He was 36.
36. And clearly smart, articulate, um, you know, fun-loving man who, you know, like you say, on the outside, you know, shows no sign of what we conceive or what we think of as, you know, an addicted, you know, especially heroin user. I mean, that's a hard drug, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I relate to what you're saying. I was thinking about this the other day. You know, I had such trouble. Uh, my journey was different than yours, but I had such trouble admitting or coming to terms with the word addiction for my kids, because I had an image of what addiction was in my head that I just couldn't put that on them. It felt harsh. It felt cruel almost, you
Mm-hmm.
know, to call them that,
Yeah.
you know, because my impression of addiction growing up was, you know, despite we had addiction in our family when I think back, but I think my interpretation of what a drug addict was either, you know, a celebrity who, you know, had an alcohol issue and went to Betty Ford, you know, some sort of
Oh, yeah.
treat
Yeah.
like experience, or, you know, hardcore people on the street, down and out, no teeth, you know, talking to
Yeah.
themselves. That's the way I pictured addiction. And so to to take my little boy, you know, and say that's what's happening, I just could not put the two together. So I can't imagine for you, like, you know, this was so, and I had all of it in front of me. I had all the signs laid out for years, and I struggled to come to terms. I can't imagine the shock for you, you know, not having ever seen any sign of it. You've never seen him use, you've never seen him high, and yet
No.
you're hearing this news that he's got an issue with heroin.
Yeah. I mean, it just absolutely blew me away. And even, you know, some of his really good friends, the two people who at his funeral spoke, they went to university together, and I said to them afterwards, didn't you know, like, did you people use a drug like heroin when you were with Kevin? And they said, no, we did dabble in marijuana, that kind of thing, but we had no idea. And these were his really good friends, you know. So the one person who did speak was another woman who was in NA with him, and he was very close to her, and he had a really strong support group in NA, and that's why um, you know, his sponsor, those kind of people were really angry at him for not reaching out this last time, not reaching out. But you know, he was ashamed.
Oh
There's a
man.
shame to it. And even, you know, for me, telling people telling people that, you know, when they say, oh, you lost your son, what happened? Because even when we put it in the paper, his obituary, I didn't want to say anything about his addiction.
Right.
You know, I think if I was doing it today, I would have, but um, I couldn't at that time. And so many people, you know, when they ask you about your kids, and they'll say, oh, what did he die from?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I say, well, Kevin struggled with substance use, and he overdosed accidentally.
Yeah.
But then I usually, you know, I'll often tell them too, like he had his master's in social work.
Yeah.
And at the end, he was working in a hospital, in in the oncology unit.
Yeah.
You know, it never fit for me.
No.
And I'd say to Kevin, when he did slip, I'd say, well, why now? Because it was always when things were going well. At least, you know, in the last few years, it was always, he'd say, Mom, I don't use when I'm upset. I use when things are going well. And I don't know why. I couldn't understand that. Initially, I think, I mean, he suffered from a lot of anxiety. And I really believe that the anxiety came from some of that early drug use, because I never saw it in Kevin as a teenager. He also told me he had bad self-esteem, which I didn't ever recognize.
Yeah. You know, what does that look like from the outside as a mom? You know, like, how do you know that?
Yeah. And I mean, I felt, when he told me that, I felt really guilty. I thought, how did I not recognize that? I mean, Kevin was always a risk taker. Kevin was always the one of our kids that, you know, if the kids were doing something they weren't supposed to do, it was usually Kevin that initiated. You know, he was just full of life, and sometimes he didn't think before he acted.
Yeah.
And when I think about the addiction and what I've learned, that it affects your brain, it affects your thinking.
Yeah.
You know, and some people are more prone to addiction than others, and then once you have that addiction, it's almost impossible to get rid of it.
Yeah, it's there. It just is.
Yeah.
You just
So it becomes a matter of handling it, you know?
yeah.
So when he died, his little girls were 2 and 5.
Mm.
And for his wife, Sarah, and those 2 girls, such a tragedy.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
for our own kids, like, you know, um, I mean, he was just such a bright light in our family.
Yeah.
You
Just
know?
leaves a big hole, hey?
Yeah.
So you mentioned that 5 years ago, or when he died, rather, that you would not have, you didn't put in the obituary that he died of drug addiction. But now, if you're doing it today, you might include that. What's changed for you?
I think it's really important to try and understand addiction. You know, we always look upon addiction as being such a, there's so much stigma attached to it. And as I've learned about addiction, I think that it's really important that we let other people know that there are people struggling with this that you don't even know are struggling with this, and that it's not always a choice. It's probably a choice in the beginning. Of course, it's a choice. He chose to try these things, but once the addiction's there and the damage is done to your brain or whatever, it's not a choice. It's a disease.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think getting that kind of getting that knowledge out there is really important.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I have spoken about it before publicly.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to do that.
That's awesome. And you've become an advocate now, for, you know, for people understanding mental health and addictions issues, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, the same with mental health. You know, our one son who has struggled the most with depression, um, he's not been able to work a lot of the time. Such an intelligent kid with a university education, and his depression is just debilitating.
Mm-hmm.
To help people to understand, you know, that it's a disease as well. It's and often I think it's a genetic thing.
Mm-hmm.
And addiction, I mean, when I look back, I thought, well, there's no addiction in my family. But when I do look back, I had an uncle who had addiction, and my mother talked about her uncles that had addiction. It was obviously somewhere there. And with mental health, I had suffered from low-grade depression starting in my 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And on my husband's side, there's mental illness as well. So because the guilty part that I felt, I thought, well, did we do something wrong?
Mm-hmm.
But, looking at our life with our kids as they were growing up, I really don't think we did.
No,
I think we had a great family, and I think we were good parents, and so I don't dwell on that.
that's good.
It certainly crossed my mind with some of the other emotions that I have felt through all this.
It's such a roller coaster of emotion, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And yeah, what I hear when I spoke to you the first time, and what I hear when I talk to you today, is such compassion. You have such compassion, and you mention anger, and you mention fear at times, and so that there is a roller coaster there, and there's a lot of feelings coming your way, and I imagine they come uninvited at times. How do you navigate through all of that as a mom?
Well, I think that for me anyway, it's talking about it that's most helpful for me. I've never been a person that likes to go to groups, support groups, or maybe because I have a social work background myself. But I do believe in talking about what's going on within you. And I mean, I did that with Kevin. Kevin was very open with me about his illness, and so was our other son, about his depression. So I think talking with, well, my husband. He's not as open as I am about what he's feeling, but he knows what I'm feeling. And talking to my daughter is, she's a really strong support for me. She's a good sounding board, and she's very wise. So if I'm getting too caught up in some of my worries, or when Kevin was alive, or even dealing with the depression in my other son, she kind of pulls me back and says, "Mom, you don't have control. You don't have control." So talking, certainly finding out about addiction, reading. I suppose I did most of my reading on the internet, but I've also talked with other people who have suffered from substance use, and I've also there's a group of 3 other moms in Peterborough that I know who have lost children to addiction. So getting that out has been really important for me, and feeling free to talk about it. And some of the fear is gone, because when Kevin was alive, whenever the phone would ring, I thought, "Oh gosh, is this Kevin calling me to tell me he had another slip?" If I answered the phone and it was him, "Oh my gosh, is he calling to tell me he had another slip?" So that fear is gone.
Yeah.
I don't like the fact that why it's gone, but
Yeah, I hear you.
yeah. So
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is that for you, processing the complex feelings that you have as a mom of a child who was struggling with addiction and ultimately died, talking to other people who understand you and some of the issues that you're talking about has been super therapeutic for you. And you've learned a lot. You've educated yourself, which has helped as well. Helps certainly on the compassion side, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And I loved Kevin. I loved him so much. Like how, I knew that was a small part of him. I mean, it certainly had a big impact on his family. And my heart aches for Sarah and for the girls, and for my own kids and all of us. There's a big hole there. But he was a great guy. And I like my husband says, I'd rather concentrate on how he lived than how he died, because he was a very compassionate person himself.
Yeah, helper.
Yeah, in every way,
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think he had an angry bone in his body, because he never, he certainly, if Kevin, with his emotions, they were out there. If he was angry, he'd be angry for a minute and then it was gone. Like
yeah.
So, so and a compassion for my other children who have gone through depression and anxiety. As a mom, to see your kids struggle and not be able to control it,
Mm-hmm.
wanting to control it, but not being
Mm-hmm.
able to control it.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what that's like.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm a slow learner though, so I had to bang my head against that wall, the control wall, for a long time before I finally accepted that I didn't have control. It sounds like you figured that out sooner than I
Well,
did.
well, no, not completely, Maureen, not completely, because I know there are times when I'm trying to control things, especially, with my son that has depression, and I have to step back.
Yeah.
It's not my, tend to be overprotective, a little bit.
Well, it's
Type
hard.
helicopter mom, maybe.
Oh, but it's such a natural mom thing and a parent thing, or I'd even say just it's hard to love someone who's struggling because you feel it. You feel some of that pain and you want to help. It's
Hmm.
such a normal thing.
Yeah.
Um, so there's parents out there that might be listening. There's people who know parents out there who maybe aren't listening, and they haven't yet found the people that they need to talk to. They're still living in isolation. They may still be living in shame. They may still be living in secrecy and living in fear of what others might think if they talk about it. I know we're getting better
Hmm.
at being honest and vulnerable and shining a light on our struggles. But for those people who haven't found their people or us yet,
Hmm.
what advice would you have for them?
Well, first of all, you've got to understand a little bit more about addiction. So, educating yourself is one thing, but when you're in the midst of that struggle and you don't know what to do, you just really have to reach out. You have to reach out to um, someone you can share it with. And like you said, it is getting a little bit easier because, I mean, it's so common. There are so many people. And one of the things, uh, and I didn't find out about this group until after Kevin died, but there's a group on Facebook called Mums Stop the Harm.
Mm.
It came out of Vancouver, and they're very active in advocating to remove the stigma about substance use, also about safe consumption sites, um, because we have to try and save these kids. You know, there's too many. There's too many of them dying. So this Mum Stop the Harm is for people who've lost children to substance use, but it's also for people living with someone who is um, presently using. So there's a lot of advice on there that's very, very helpful.
Mm.
Um, and I mean, if there's anything local, there really wasn't a lot in Peterborough at the time, and certainly the shame kept me from talking to very many people about it at all.
Yeah, me too. Kept me quiet for a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So
and what the other thing that kept me quiet was talking to the wrong people by accident. Like I would blurt something out, and then I would totally project my own shame, onto them and think that they were seeing me as shameful, and then I would, retreat again. And so there was
mhm,
all kinds of that sort of thing too, until I found people that got it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And one good thing is that a lot, because I mean Kevin grew up here. A lot of people knew him and knew us, and
Yeah.
they didn't. I don't think anybody that knew him really judged him.
Yeah.
At least I hope they didn't. The I've had a real problem with some of the things written online or whatever that people write about people with addiction issues.
It's hard.
Like really hard because I know that. Well, they didn't know Kevin, and I did, but it hurts.
It
It
does.
hurts, Um, at Christmas time, one of the other moms that lost her daughter, she and I worked on setting up a tree in one of the local malls, and on that tree we had big Christmas balls with pictures of people who had died from addiction from Peterborough. So people, would give us their children's pictures and we would put them up, and that received, it was mostly positive. But like one man came up to her and said, well, I think they should all be taken out in a field and shot. Like, or they couldn't have been a good person. They're just a druggie. Like those kind of things just stab you in the heart. And I'm so defensive. I'm so defensive because that was not my Kevin.
No. I just, when I hear someone say something like that, I just think, what kind of pain is going on there?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Like that's hate.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so something's going on there. There's some pain, harsh pain way
Yeah.
under there. For someone to come to a mom and say something like that, that's
A mom
wow.
who was standing there,
Oh
obviously,
my
with
gosh.
this tree.
Oh gosh, that just breaks my heart. Like I wonder what that man must be going through. And I can say that today, but man, if I was standing there in the mall, Claire, with you,
I wasn't there.
oh,
She told me that the next time I was there. So, but that there are lots of people that think that way.
yeah,
And
there are.
so that education is so important. And like the safe injection sites, a lot of people think that's just making the problem carry on.
Oh yeah.
But when someone is in that state of addiction and they're craving, to me it's better that they go someplace where they can get a safe amount of the drug, but also that those sites have people who can direct them to where they can go and get some help.
Yeah, it's absolutely keeping people safe until they're ready.
Yes.
To take action, and the more compassionate we can be with people, if you study this, the more compassionate we are and the less shaming we are and stigmatizing we are, the more likely people are to embrace help.
Yes.
When it's there. It's hard. It's such a tough thing. And you've talked about, so Sarah, so Kevin's wife, has been a very vocal advocate.
Yes.
As well. She's been published. She's done TED Talks, and phenomenal work. You talked about feeling a little bit protective of Kevin's memory at times, and you've talked about it in this call. So tell me about that. So how do you handle that when you're feeling like, oh, but
yes.
it was also,
Yeah, I mean it's in some ways it's been a little bit difficult to have it all out there in such a public forum. And sometimes initially I sort of tighten up and think, oh, I don't want that out there. I don't want everybody thinking that Kevin's going around his house, injecting heroin every minute of the day. I want them to know the true story, So I am defensive, but then I also know that his story is important for other people to hear. Mm-hmm. It's important for other people to know what kind of man he was, and that he was a good dad. Mm-hmm. He was a good husband, mm-hmm. Even though people say, well, how could he be a good husband if that was going on? Mm-hmm. But he was. And Sarah will tell you the same thing, mm-hmm. But I mean, it was a struggle for her, absolutely a struggle for her then and now. Mm-hmm. And so, I sort of work through all those negative feelings and think, yeah, it's okay that it's out there. Mm-hmm. If it's going to help somebody, then it's good.
What are you most proud of Kevin for?
I'm proud of Kevin for his struggle.
Yeah.
When we went to his house after he died to pick up his clothing and that kind of thing, beside his bed were his books, the top one, Staying Clean. Mm. On the wall, a written note about doing your meditation. Like he tried.
Yeah.
He tried. And I'm proud of him for being the kind of dad he was.
Yeah.
And I'm proud of him as the person, the compassionate person he was. And he didn't, he said to me, Mom, some of my friends use drugs, but they didn't become addicted. Why did
Mhm.
I become addicted? He was ashamed. And he was such a beautiful person. Like, my heart just breaks that he's gone.
I
Just,
bet. I bet. So, if you could wave your magic wand, Claire, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the way society views mental health and addiction, I group them together.
yeah, yeah, because they certainly do go together.
Yeah, mental health and addictions. What would you change?
Um, I think I would somehow change the stigma. I would wish that people could look upon addiction as a medical disease. Uh, I wish that Kevin could have gone to his doctor and said, I'm really struggling with this heroin addiction. Is there something you can do to help me?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, if I could go there when I have a craving, if I could get in to see my doctor, if they could see it as a disease, because it is a disease.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, like I said, there are people who think it's a choice, but at some point it's not a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be my biggest hope, is that through education, through some of the people that are advocating for doing something to change the system,
Mm-hmm.
that's what I would hope. Like just this week, I saw some statistics from BC. There were more people in BC who passed away from substance use between January and May this year than there were from COVID.
Mm-hmm. It's a pandemic.
Yes, and there's so much caring and for COVID, and there should be, absolutely there should be, but there should be caring for substance use as well.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, it's a disease.
Yeah, we have so many, fundraisers and telethons and things like that for certain diseases, and yet for addiction, it's the underground, quiet. You know, we're just trying to get a safe injection site up here without too much fuss, and
Yeah,
there's not the same. It doesn't tug at the heartstrings addiction,
no,
and so it's hard to get people behind
yeah,
treatment for addictions and
because they've talked about safe injection site here, safe consumption they should call it, the
yeah.
site here, but they can't find a place where anybody who has a building will rent to you for that reason.
Absolutely, and we have some here. We have some sites here in Calgary, and it's been quite controversial. And of course, anything controversial becomes quite political.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
well, there's an increase in crime, around consumptions of sites and antisocial behaviors around consumption sites, and that goes hand in hand with mental health and addictions issues. And so then I step back and say, well, systemically, like as a society, what's wrong here?
Yeah.
What's going on here that we have people that are so lonely? So I always think about it as unable to process feelings. I know that when my behaviors hit the addiction spectrum, and I talk about behavior or substances, I'm not addicted to drugs or alcohol, but don't put a lemon meringue pie in front of me when I'm feeling down, because that is gone. So when I start to self-soothe in ways that are, potentially harmful or certainly take me out of my feelings, which is what I'm always trying to do. I want
Mm-hmm.
to feel different. I want to feel
Yeah.
different than I feel.
Yeah.
Um, I think back to, well, I've not learned to effectively process the feelings that I'm having. I'm not learned how to accept them without judgment, shame, and I avoid them. And that then leads me into behaviors and substances that push it over here.
Yeah.
So how do we teach kids, how to process their feelings so that they don't end up in a situation in which they're using substances or behaviors to numb or feel different or get that dopamine fix or whatever it is that they need at that time.
Well, and I've heard that at some of the forums we've had here, where police officers, social workers, people with substance use problems have spoken, and one of the things that they do say is you have to reach the kids when they're younger, and
Mhm,
it's exactly that. Try and teach them to how do they deal with anxiety,
mhm.
how do they deal with rejection or with feelings, period.
Feelings.
Because like I know that there's people who say that drug addiction results from trauma, someone who's had trauma, and I always railed against that because I never felt Kevin had trauma, but something something in him, like I used to think it was just because he was a risk taker,
Mm,
he wanted to try things, but I mean, I know the anxiety was at times really debilitating, although he said he didn't use then, but initially I wonder what started it. And
mhm,
I wish I had asked him that. I wish I knew
mhm.
exactly what it was, you know. But something is caught, and I mean, a lot of the people who have substance use problems do have a lot of feelings that they haven't been able to deal with.
For sure. And think of, you mentioned the word trauma, and I've railed against that as well. I mean, I know your family. I can't imagine a more stable, loving home than yours. And so, like when you think about, well, what kind of trauma did Kevin experience? Like, that's a really good question. What kind of trauma did Kevin experience? Like, and we can sit here and we can guess and we can try and figure it out. And for me, ultimately, I had to change my thinking around trauma. Trauma to me used to mean, abuse, like big T trauma. There had to have been physical, sexual, mental, emotional abuse in the home or outside of the home somewhere that nobody knew about. Something terrible must have happened.
Hmm.
You know, uh, you know, big story,
Yeah,
big
yeah.
story trauma. And then, I've sort of come around to the idea that trauma can maybe trauma is any emotion that you've not been able to process.
Hmm.
We stuff it down and we store it instead of feeling it, and it just hangs out there until.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing Kevin did say to me was, "Mom, I always had self-esteem issues," and like Kevin was the clown, he was the fun guy. Um, he never had an issue with alcohol. He was never addicted, and once he got into NA, he didn't drink at all,
Mhm.
because he figured it could be an addiction as well. But sometimes I wonder, well, did he use drugs in the beginning to be freer, to feel more accepted, um, and it just kept going on and on. I don't know,
Mhm.
but there's something. But I do think also there's an addictive personality. Like when Kevin did it, if he was enthused about something, he went at it 150%.
Yeah. And some of the most fun people I know are addicts because of that, right? Like they're
Yeah,
risk takers. They go at things very intensely. They're excitable. They're like, they got a great idea, like
yeah,
this is a personality that I love hanging out with.
yeah,
They're fun,
yeah.
fun
Oh,
people.
absolutely.
Yeah. um, so Claire, let me think here. What if we're ending this conversation, um, what's the message you want to put out for people?
Don't judge.
Don't judge.
Don't judge. Uh, Try to learn about addiction yourself, so that you can be more compassionate. Um, don't look down on on people who have substance use issues, because they're suffering in their own way. They're suffering. So have some compassion and maybe try to walk in their shoes a little bit. Um, and that's not easy. When I hear some of the moms on this Mom Stop the Harm, and some of the things they're going through with their kids, kids stealing to get money for drugs, kids full of anger, like I didn't deal with that. But if I did, I don't know how I would have reacted. I'm just thankful that I didn't. Because it's not easy, I'm sure, to be with someone who's like that. And many people who have addiction issues can when they're using drugs or alcohol, they can be angry, they can be horrible. But not everybody's like that. And if they are like that, they're suffering. They're really suffering inside. So have some compassion.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Claire. Thank you for sharing your story. I know that coming back into your story and revisiting the situation and the feelings is taxing. And I appreciate you doing that on this call. Thank you for that, because there's a lot of people out there just like you who need to hear what you have to say. So thank you very, very much for that.
Thanks, Maureen.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
At
Bye.
this point, I had stopped the recording, and Claire and I kept talking, and she held up a photo of her son, Kevin. And I thought, I'll hit the record button again because I wanted to capture that. So that's what you're going to hear next. Enjoy.
Thank you for showing me a picture of Kevin, because that is, like you say, that is a man that, if that was a social worker coming into the hospital, I want to talk to him.
Yeah, and there was one lady that came to his funeral who her husband was in the nursing home that Kevin worked in, and she just loved Kevin and said, my husband didn't talk to a lot of people, but Kevin would come in and sit down and they'd talk about, the old days. He would tell Kevin about his war days, and Kevin would be totally, engrossed in conversation. Like everybody loved him. He was a lovable guy.
Yeah. Well, I'm so sorry that he's gone.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry that I didn't know him. I think I knew him maybe when he was very, very tiny.
Yes.
But I never knew him as an adult. So thank you very much, Claire.
You're very welcome.
Friends, thank you very much for listening. I am again your host, Maureen Towns, and I'm the founder of Maureen Towns Consulting. And what I do is I support families who are really struggling to support people in their family or people that they love who have mental health and addictions issues. And I help take those families from chaos to calm. My work is based on my 25 plus years working in healthcare as a nurse, both in the public and the private system in both Ontario and Alberta, and also my education and facilitation in leadership, and also my success and my failures as a mom supporting children with mental health and addictions issues. And you can read all about those issues and how I came to know what I know and all the things that I wish I had known years ago when I began the journey with my kids in the book that I'm going to publish this year called Broken Open. Same name as the podcast. You can find me at MaureenTowns.com. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to chat with anybody. And if you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe and share widely. Take care of yourself, my friends. Bye.